And joining us now on the debate, Tom Zizis, author of The Working Better Report for the Metcalf Foundation. Linda Franklin, CEO of Colleges Ontario and the Ontario Workforce Shortage Coalition. Dina Ladd, coordinator of the Workers' Action Centre. And Francis Fong, economist in charge of Canadian Special Studies at TD Economics. Good to have everybody around the table here. We just had a week in Waterloo, so you're our first kick at it back here in Toronto. And I want to start by reading something. Tom, this will be an excerpt from your report. We'll start with an excerpt from that and then come back and talk. What was once assumed to be a relatively homogeneous labor market system, firms that offered permanent employment and a predictable process of career advancement, has broken apart and is now dominated by two main systems. One is a labor market of low-level jobs characterized by modest pay, little job security, and limited opportunities for advancement. The other is the knowledge economy, a highly flexible, mobile, and fluid system for knowledge workers in which advancement typically depends on each individual's credentials, prior experience, and social networks. Okay, this is kind of the hourglass economy as you describe it in your report. So give us a broader sense, Tom, of what you see as the problem here.
Well, there are several things that happened. When we moved from a system of relying on permanent employment, we also didn't put as much emphasis on developing careers for individuals. So individuals had to come to the workplace already ready with credentials, sometimes ready with experience. So we tended not to invest as much in workplace training and started shifting the cost and the expectation of that preparation outside the workplace.
And the consequences of that have been what?
Well, that people aren't necessarily getting socialized for the kind of work that they're being asked to do. They may come with certain skills, but they may not necessarily be the people who the employer is looking for because they haven't been groomed for that particular position. On the other hand, if you look at the entry-level positions, those are no longer the places where employers look to develop people for the future jobs. They become the dead-end jobs. And so we have people who are stuck in positions that aren't leading anywhere and where the entry-level wages have been decreasing. And so we're having a polarization not only of occupations but also of incomes.
Okay, Francis, you're at TD and you guys did a report as well. Your report for TD Economics, you did it with Don Drummond, who's been a guest on this program many times. People know him. You wrote, the Canadian workplace has undergone, quote, a seismic shift. So how much of that relates to what he's just talked about in his report?
Oh, it's absolutely very much related. What we're seeing is basically that the technological changes has happened over, say, the last 20 years. All of the new machinery equipment, all of the new computers, all of the new software that we've been implementing, that's been very effective at replacing what Tom's been getting at is sort of these middle-income jobs, but it's been very poor at getting rid of, say, the entry-level jobs that Tom was referring to, and of course the sort of knowledge-based jobs, the high-level jobs. And so you have exactly what he was saying, this polarization. The seismic shift that I was referring to in my paper, it was more broad in the sense of it talks about things like how much of our labor force is being taken up by the baby boomer generation. Where are the jobs being generated? Are we seeing lots of manufacturing jobs, which we're not, or are we seeing lots of services jobs, which we are? So we're something about 70% services employment. That's up from, say, the mid-70s when it was in the 60s, 60%, something like that.
And of course, those happen to be jobs which tend to pay less, right?
Right, absolutely. Services-based jobs tend to pay less than the more traditional manufacturing jobs in the 1950s. And so we're seeing these various shifts, not just in the sort of levels of jobs that are being generated, but where they're being generated and who's taking up those jobs.
Okay, and the person responsible for educating all of these workers of tomorrow is you. It's all on your shoulders. The community colleges of this province educate how many people at any one time?
About 500,000 people, full and part-time every year.
Okay, so your job, I guess, is to prepare everybody for a workplace that now looks like this. Was this anticipated?
Well, you know, I don't think the workplace is ever anticipated. You know, when you look at how many times we've tried to predict how many doctors we need, how many nurses we need, how many skilled tradespeople, we never get it right. But I think what we do know, and what all sorts of research is showing us, is that as time goes on, everybody is going to need to be highly skilled, and more highly skilled than they are today. It doesn't matter whether you're in a manufacturing job or in financial services. You're going to need to have a greater level of skills, and you're probably going to need to have more flexible skills, skills that can move you from one job to another as you go through your career.
Or else?
Or else you risk, I think, in the coming labor market shortage that we're going to have, if people aren't well skilled, we're going to have a terrible situation where we have all sorts of jobs that are going begging because there aren't skilled workers to fill them, and all sorts of people who are permanently unemployable because they don't have the skills necessary to take the jobs that exist.
We'll talk more about that labor market of the future. Dina, let me get you into this. First of all, Workers Action Center. What is that?
Well, we're a non-profit center that works with workers in precarious work. So we deal with workplace problems that temp workers, contract workers, workers who are independent contractors, the new world of workers, basically, the ones who constitute nearly 40% of the labor market. We support workers who are not in unions, who, again, increasingly a larger number of workers. And we deal with problems like unpaid wages, not getting access to employment insurance, Canada Pension Plan, being misclassified.
How many clients you got?
Well, we have a hell of a lot of clients that call us on our phone lines. We do a lot of workshops. We do a lot of education to people about what their rights are in the labor market. And I think the conversation so far has been really focused on sort of individual workers. And I think that one of the things that we see is the responsibility of employers. And I think what we're seeing there is that employers are expecting workers to have all of these skills, all of these trainings, and to be able to fit right into their into their workforce, because they want a just-in-time, flexible workforce. And so if that means hiring people through a temp agency or through a subcontractor, not having any responsibility for them, for their training, for their education, for their legal rights, that's the kinds of trends that we're seeing.
Let me just try this. You're running a company. You see that Linda's educating 500,000 people across the province in her community colleges, millions more in universities across Ontario. Would an employer not presume that our people, our workers of the future, our employees of the future, are being well trained in post-secondary institutions, and therefore they don't have to do it?
Well, I think that the responsibility lies with both. I think that you need to not assume that, I think that you should assume that the college system is preparing people for the workforce. But I think that if you're in an increasingly knowledge-based economy, if you're wanting specific skills for your specific company, there should be a responsibility to ensure that you are thinking through apprenticeship programs, internships, you're thinking through succession planning, not at the last minute, but 10, 15 years in advance. You should be thinking about how are you hiring people and not just wanting a flexible, just-in-time workforce.
Is that how it works out there, Tom?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I think the issue here is that in expecting this kind of just-in-time workforce, we're expecting the employee to do all the preparatory work. And employers also have a responsibility to invest in training. In Ontario and in Canada, we have one of the lowest rates of investment in workforce training, on-the-job training. And so we adopted a system where we're really trying to cut costs. We were scared of overseas competition, of lower wage jurisdictions, and so we ended up deciding to go the low wage approach and the low training approach. And if we're to succeed, and where we succeed in the knowledge economy, is because we have high-end workers, high-skilled workers. We're not necessarily finding all the work, even for all the college and university graduates that we have. This is another problem with
Francis looks like he did pretty well. How old are you, Francis?
I'm 27.
You're 27. You're working at one of the biggest companies in the country, right? TD Bank.
Right.
So you did okay.
I seem to do okay. Yeah, absolutely.
How come?
Absolutely. Well, I guess this is a factor of my generation. Is basically you go out, you go to school.
Where'd you go to school?
I went to Western for my undergrad, and I went to Queen's for my master's. So one of the factors that allowed me to get my job was when I had to go out and pursue more education than sort of was considered the standard back then. You had your bachelor's and you were taken care of. That was the expectation back in, say, 1970s, 1980s. That's no longer the expectation. Increasingly, people with bachelor's degrees are finding themselves sort of out of luck when they enter the labor market, and they have to go back to get an MBA, get a master's, go to college and get a trade certificate, something along those lines. That's sort of a trend that we've been seeing, and I think we need to invest more in attracting people to do that same process, because even though, as you said, there's tons of people going out and getting post-secondary education, it's still not enough for the sort of labor, the demands that will be prevalent 10, 20 years from now when the baby boom generation is retiring.
And you know, Steve, we are seeing this all the time in colleges too, as was just said. We see now lots and lots of university graduates, 12 to 15%, that go back to college as almost a finishing school, saying, well, you know what, now I have a great theoretical education, but what do I do to make an employer interested in me? My own sons are in that right now. We figure we'll be educating them till they're 35, I think, to get them through school.
How old are they right now?
21 and 23, so
and they've graduated from university?
And they're off to college. One of them did it in reverse, college to university. The other one, university just wrapping up, intending to go on to college or another university degree when he's finished, because he doesn't believe, like Francis said, it's going to be sufficient. And you know, the same is true around employers. We see more and more employers, because we work with industry groups, advisory groups at the colleges to design curriculum, saying to us, we do want our workers to come out of college ready to hit the shop floor or our work environment, completely ready to work, fully engaged. A lot of the employers donate equipment and other things to the colleges so that the students are working on up-to-date equipment so they can hit the ground running.
Well, we talk about the marketplace of the future, and let's just, if we can, I think this is from your report actually, Francis. Michael, if you would, let's bring these numbers up. By the year 2025, the projected shortfall of workers is 360,000. This is only in the province of Ontario. Go 5 years beyond that. By the year 2030, a projected shortfall of more than 500,000 people. And a third of the current labor force is expected to retire by that year, by the year 2030. Now, presumably, Tom, isn't this good news? That suggests there'll be a lot of job vacancies out there for people who've got the right education and skills to match them.
Well, first of all, people who have post-secondary degrees right now, a large proportion in Toronto, around 19% of them, are working in entry-level jobs. So they are not accessing the so-called knowledge economy. Yes, as labor shortages start emerging, employers are going to be, there's going to be an incentive for them to start bringing those kinds of people into the workforce, preparing them for those jobs. But we don't have the systems in place to do that. And this is what I'm getting at in my report, that we've changed systems and we haven't adapted to what's been happening in the workplace in terms of better connections between our training bodies, between our employment services with employers. We're very much focused on what may be the deficiencies of people who are unemployed, but we're not really meeting to the needs of employers, and employers are not always interacting with the system in the way we need them to.
Dina.
I think that when we have these conversations sometimes, I think one of the things that sometimes frustrates me, because this is my job that I've been doing for the past 20 years, is that there's a whole segment of our communities and our workforce that we're not talking about. You know, we need to be talking about immigrants coming into this country who have a lot of credentials and who are not getting accepted in a lot of the professions. So when you see the numbers on shortfalls, for instance, and you see that there's these massive gaps, we need to be having a conversation about what's happening with those highly skilled immigrants. I think we also need to be having a conversation about other sectors of the workforce that don't fit into the knowledge-based economy. Not all of us are going to be working in high tech. Many of us are going to be working in community services, are going to be working in hospitals, healthcare, education. I hear
you, but those numbers suggest that if you've got the right skills, there will be jobs out there for you.
Yeah. But I think what happens though is that the way in which employers are hiring workers are also, it's not being reflected in those numbers. We see a lot of people being de-skilled in the current labor market, and Tom touches on this in his report. Well, that means that, let's take an electrician, for instance. An electrician right now could be making a decent job, decent income, right? $25, $26, $27 an hour. However, if you look at construction sites, what happens is development companies hire subcontractors, subcontractors hire contractors, contractors hire individual electricians. They're self-employed, they make $10 to $12 an hour because they are bottom of the food chain here. And so we see that setup happening in many different sectors, in trucking, driving, the financial sectors, in business sectors. We see them in healthcare, the whole move to privatization and contracting out of workers.
Let me get Francis on this. Is this kind of a, the other side of the story that we don't hear as much about?
Well, I did want to talk about one of the issues that Dina had brought up about attracting our immigrant population and getting employment rates up in that sector of our labor force. I mean, we hear about this all the time where people have PhDs and they're driving cabs. Massive portions of our labor force are being underutilized. There's still a big wage gap that's unexplained between men and women. Immigrants are doing very, very poorly. And yet, why? You know, why is this the case in a Canadian society where we tend to consider ourselves very inclusive and we want to get rid of all these things, and yet they're still there? So, and there's
you got some answers?
I
see this every day. I challenge anyone to go pick up the phones on our hotlines on a daily basis and hear the kinds of calls coming through. I mean, I think that there's the issue of credentials being recognized and the barriers to the labor market, which we've talked about. But I also think it's the way in which people are hired. If we've got 40% of your workforce now in precarious jobs, which means many of people are not being hired directly by employers, they're being hired through temp agencies, they're being hired through contractors. I mean, a lot of young people nowadays think, I've got a one-year contract, I'm really lucky. This has become something that people have no expectations of in terms of having a career.
The days of jobs for life are over, for sure, we know that.
I'm not talking about a career for life. I'm talking about even being hired directly by an employer so that you can actually be recognized by that employer and actually have your wages, your skills recognized.
Understood. Linda?
I think that's a moment in time that we're in right now. I'd absolutely agree. But I think the statistics you mentioned earlier, Steve, suggest that that's not our future. And it's not, I believe. I think when we start to fall into these labor market shortages, which we haven't been in a very long time, the onus on employers to hire full-time, to train their workers, to engage staff so that they keep them will change dramatically. And then I think the challenge we'll have is something we saw with retraining unemployed workers recently, where you have people who've been in the labor force a long time. And I'd say that the knowledge economy over time is everybody, frankly. Everybody's going to need higher levels of skills. And the trouble we're seeing is a lot of workers who've been in the workforce a long time don't have the literacy skills they need, don't have the IT computer background that they need. So as we look at a labor market that is really requiring lots and lots more people, we'll need all the immigrants working at the highest levels they can, but we'll also need to reskill our current workforce to take higher level jobs coming out of it.
Let me put my cynic's hat on for a second. It's you represent the community colleges of this province. It's in your interest to think that nobody can get a job in the future unless they go to community college. So we get that. But the question then becomes, are you pumping out the adequate graduates for the jobs that will be out there? You know, there are shortages, but are you in fact training the people to those shortages?
Well, you know, I think we are to the best of our ability because community colleges are pretty agile, pretty nimble. We work with industry groups in communities all over the province, and so they tell us, here's what we need them for, here's the skill set, here's how many of them. Now, having said that, as I said earlier, we're always going to get it wrong. We're never going to be able to say, we need 23 electricians in Peterborough this month and 48 in Northern Ontario. So I think the onus on post-secondary in the future is going to be more around how do we teach people the flexible skills to do well in a number of work environments? How do we teach them that it's okay to go back to school and be comfortable doing that? How do we adapt training so that it fits with somebody who has a mortgage and kids and yet needs to go back and get retrained? And how do we teach employers that maybe there's a way to look at somebody who's been laid off in one sector and say, well, you know, there's a core set of skills they have that our sector could use. And if we could just train them for the gap that exists, we'll get them into our workforce faster, which we don't see.
I think there's a couple of really important issues here. One, and Linda's brought up a really great one, is the severe lack of good labor market information that we have in Canada. If I'm a worker in Ontario and I want to work in, say, Alberta, the information necessary for me to do that, what kind of permits do I need? Do I need do I need to register with the province? Those kinds of things. It's not readily available to people who want to do that. So that's one issue. The second one really has to do with where the state of education is right now. There is a huge untapped pool of labor in Canada or in Ontario, where you have a lot of people who are, say, in the lower income brackets who can't access post-secondary education, and our funding system, although is very generous, is not targeted enough to be able to handle that. I'll give you an example. We have what's called needs-based funding, is basically bursaries and grants for people in low income families. For students in the highest income quartile, their parents' income is in the highest income quartile, they get about half the needs-based funding as those students in the lowest income quartile. Now that would be, I'm not necessarily drawing conclusions, but that might suggest that there are people in the highest income quartile that are getting funding that they may not need it. I'm not saying that people in the highest income quartile should not get any funding. Certainly, it's up to your own personal circumstances as to what kind of funding you need.
If it's needs-based, you think it would go to the other end.
Exactly right. So you should technically have the majority of funding going to those in the lowest income quartile, and we're not seeing that. So there's huge issues in terms of education funding.
And there's a similar issue
access,
with,
right?
There's a similar issue with people who are retraining. So the province, a year and a half ago or so, put out a program called Second Career, where they're taking laid-off workers, putting them through college for a year or two, and out they go into the workforce. And it was hugely successful. But the challenge...
That's not what I heard. I heard there was barely any uptake on it at all.
Oh, no, my gosh, no. In the first
couple of years.
No, in the first couple of months, there was hardly any uptake because people were grieving. You know, I've lost my career. Am I going to go back to school with kids my kids' age? I did lousy in school. What about that? But by the time they got over that and started to see that there was money on the table that allowed them to afford to go back to school, that program in 18 months went through all the money that was supposed to be for 3 years and all the students. And now it's been made a permanent part of the strategy for retraining workers because it was so clear the demand was huge.
I remember that. It was a centerpiece of Dwight Duncan's budget a few years ago, and I remember when they brought it out. I mean, we did a program up in Thunder Bay, and there were people who were laid off in mills, 300 miles north of Thunder Bay, who said they expect me to go to school in community college 300 miles south of where I live. I can't do that.
Well, yeah, and so for the solution for some of those folks was, again, over time, to realize that was happening and start to put them in classroom settings with video conferencing, with e-learning sites. So it was an interesting transition to get, as I say, to the point where it was, oh dear gosh, what a failure, to, oh my gosh, we can't keep up with the demand. And I think there's lots of lessons there that we'll have to relearn as we start to hit this labor market.
But I think
shortage.
the point that you mentioned, which I think is really important, is the ability for workers to go back to school and have an income. And I think that, we've seen so many, thousands of workers go back to school, but I think income is really important. And I think that's where I think there is a responsibility, I believe, on employers to also upgrade their workforces, their current workforces that they have right now, and allow access to literacy, English as a second language, sort of training on technology. Those used to be workplace based, right, in the 70s and 80s. I don't think that, I think, and they were very successful. And I think that means then, a worker is not just put into a hole when they've lost their job, but they actually have those skills. And I think the workplace is a real site for training and education. And I think that there's a responsibility there and employers can play a very valuable role to do that. However, if you are working through a temp agency and you're not considered to be part of that workforce and you're there for 6 months and then you're thrown out, and then you go to another company and you work there for 3 months and then you get thrown out and you work for another company, how are you going to ever get access to any training, to any stable income?
On the other hand, some of us at this table are old enough to remember, what were they called? Kelly girls? Right? This is the guy, Mr. Kelly, I can't remember his first name, but Mr. Kelly invented, 50 years ago, this idea of, if you just need somebody to come in and answer the phones for a week, call me, I got a Kelly girl.
But that's not the case anymore, I think.
Well, it is. People need temp employment all the time.
You have permanent people who are doing permanent employment jobs who are going through temp agencies.
It's not a daily basis anymore.
So I guess a couple of things I want to jump in on. One is, if we're talking about training and education, currently Canada and Ontario have the highest rates of post-secondary grads in the world. We have met the call. Right?
What is it?
It's 64%
64%.
Right now. Projections suggest it should be around 75 in about 15 years.
75% of Ontarians will have graduated from some post-secondary institution
in about the next 15 years.
In the next 15
right now,
years.
64.
That's a good number.
We also have the highest rates of post-secondary grads, both college and university grads, who are making below half the median income. So we have the highest rates of grads and the lowest incomes for our grads.
What does that suggest to you?
Well, again, I think it's not simply a matter of credentials. I think it has to do with how we've organized our work. If we're just looking for just-in-time employment, if we're going for the lowest cost solution, then we're going on a race to the bottom.
But that's going to be a feature of every economy everywhere in the world. Doesn't have to be the largest part of it.
We do have choices. We can invest in productivity. The reason why we also have challenges economically is because our productivity growth rates have been so small compared to our competitors is because we're relying on other measures to reduce our costs. We're not investing in innovation, in productivity. We're not investing in our workforces. It's not only the education system, it's what's happening in the workplace. And that's the point.
Well, Francis, let me try this with you. We make the promise to young people in this province that if you go to one of Linda's colleges, or if you go to one of the universities around this province, and you get out with a degree or two, depending on what you need, there'll be a decent job waiting for you in that workplace somewhere. Are we lying to young people about that? Is that no longer the way it is?
See, what I think the situation is that fundamentally the labor market has shifted, and that was one of those seismic shifts that I mentioned, is that if you look at the Generation Y, or people in Generation Y, I mean, even the perception is no longer of staying in one job forever. And I'm not trying to say anything about what you do, Dina, because I think it's great, and I think it's very necessary to protect a very highly exploitable portion of our population. At the same time, there's an increasing trend towards temporary work in general. I think there's a statistic that said something like 75% of part-time workers are there voluntarily. And that could be a reflection of, I have children at home and I want to work part-time to get some extra income, but I don't want to work 80 hours a week. Yeah, exactly. I don't want to work that long. I want to see my kids. Self-employed, I don't want to work that long, or something like that. I think there's a shift going towards that in general. And when people come out in university, yes, there's this expectation that you should be getting a decent job. The issue is that our labor force is sort of at a turning point. Linda's been talking about this workforce shortage. You know, when our labor force shortage, or when our labor force growth does sort of slow down very dramatically, then you're going to see some increasing demand for younger workers. But right now, we have a lot of older workers who weren't able to leave because the recession sort of destroyed their nest egg, or they don't want to leave the workforce. You know, there's sort of this increasing provision for older workers as well, that they keep them on. So there's a lot of demand for jobs right now.
When the boomers retire, it's going to open a lot more doors.
Oh, absolutely.
But I think, Francis, it's not. I don't think that the drive or the growth in part-time flexible work has been because of workers deciding, I want to have more flexibility and I want to have more leisure time. In fact, when you look at the reality of people's choices, most people would actually say, I'd like a full-time job with stability, and a pension would be nice, and benefits, right?
It's not out there.
But it's not out there. And so it's not because people themselves have suddenly decided that they don't want this and that they suddenly want to retrain 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times in their lifetime. I think that we cannot have this conversation around training without having a corresponding look at the way in which people are hired and employers' role in this in terms of shifting the way they run their businesses.
So what would you do about it?
Well, I would increase regulation. I would increase the kinds of...
That is exactly what businesses don't want to hear.
Absolutely.
I mean, if you think... Take a step back here. If the whole idea is provinces are competing with each other, saying we're open for business, come create jobs here, the way you ensure that we're not open for business is by making more regulations to how people get hired.
So then what do you say to the worker who doesn't get any access to any employment standards? I mean, is it okay then for us to have a huge polarization in our income, to have a core people, a group of knowledge-based, highly paid workers that have all the perks and have the corner office, and then you have a mass of people who basically are struggling to survive?
But you know,
and so I would say that it's also about not just a free-for-all economy. I would say that you can have a regulated economy where people have a basic expectation that they're going to get employment standards, they're going to be able to take care of their families. And I'm not willing to give that up. I'm not willing to say to people, I'm sorry, you know, if you make $5 an hour, not my problem, because I'm making $200,000 a year.
Linda.
I think that's true, but I think the challenge is regulating for a moment in time. So I think employers have some of the choices that Tom and Dina have been talking about, because we have a labor market shortage right now, or surplus rather. When we get to the labor markets that are short and that employers are desperately needing people, I think a lot of these issues will disappear on their own, simply because the market is going to drive employers to behave differently. And I think the one other thing I'd say, just to Tom's point about the employment level of graduates may not be employed at exactly the level we'd like them today. There's been a recession, there's been an economic slowdown. It started in Ontario a few years before every place else. But I can tell you, they have a better chance of getting employed with a post-secondary education, and they have a better chance of not being laid off. So, to your point, are we lying to them? We're not lying to them.
Entry-level jobs, they're displacing people who normally would access those jobs.
I mean, I think a good
skills.
college education, I think the community college system is excellent, right? I mean, I think everyone needs to go to community college, but the thing is, to rely that the market is going to just somehow make everything better, I don't think so. Because if you look at even the last 4 years, how are employers bringing workers into this country? They're bringing them in through the temporary foreign migrant workers program. That's how they're bringing in their qualified workers. They're not investing locally to ensure that the people that we have in our economy right now, in our labor force who are unemployed, are getting access to them. But they're saying, I need this right now. I'm going to bring in 100 people from overseas, and they're going to be here tied to me.
Okay, let her respond.
And so I...
Let her respond.
Yeah,
That's partly true, Dina, but I got to tell you, in the community colleges, in the communities we're working in, we see time and time again employers coming to us saying, we'd like to help you develop curriculum. Green energy is a great example. We have a new emerging field. We really want to train workers, and by the way, we'll hire them as soon as you can train them. We have an agreement with Ontario Hydro and 5 community colleges, and they're taking every graduate we can produce. So I don't think it's black and white. I think some of what you're saying is going on.
Talk to us about the market. Is the market going to resolve this?
See, I think that the issue Dina is talking about is, I think we already to some degree have regulations in place, but there are firms out there that sort of game the system, that aren't, they're not protected. We have a huge, especially in Ontario, we have a huge portion of immigrants that come here and they're highly exploitable because their language skills, they may not have all the information necessary, what kind of rights they have, what kind of labor laws are in place to protect them, and they get exploited in these situations.
But they're not exploited because they don't speak English. They're exploited because employers are exploiting them.
Exactly.
And they're taking advantage.
Right, and they're not aware
so
of what's available to them. And I think to Tom's point, a lot of the people who have university degrees that are earning relatively low wages, I would suspect that a lot of those people would be immigrants. Again, they come here and their credentials are not recognized. They don't have the sort of skills necessary to compete with sort of Canadian-born citizens. And ultimately, it's an issue of retraining people. It's an issue of getting education better, and this is all related. I think we
can train and educate our way out of this problem.
I think so. If we invest enough in education, then we can produce innovative people. We can increase productivity. We can do all those things.
Let me try
if we
this.
have that in place.
Just got a few minutes left here, and please don't anybody misunderstand this next question as somehow an attack on unions. We're all unionized around here, for goodness sakes. However, in the past, labor unions have played a large and significant role in making sure that workplace conditions are the way workers would like them to be. But our workplaces are changing. It is a more solitary nature. The work, as we've already talked about, is different than the kind of work you might have had in a big manufacturing plant. We work out of home now. We work part-time. We have temporary gigs. It's more diffuse. Does this call, Tom, you first, does this call for a new, I don't know what, a new something to recognize the way that work is changing?
Definitely work has changed and we have to adapt, and I think there are several levels at which we have to adapt. In some instances it is going to be regulatory. In some instances it is trying to find collective voices for workers to balance the power, the relationships with employers. In some instances we have to also explain the case to employers around, for the sake of the economy, we want to have stronger consumer demand that's based on better wages. Right, that are more equitably distributed. And in some cases, there are good business practices that are being applied by employers. There are good business practices and training practices that are being applied by colleges that have to be distributed more, that have to be diffused more. We don't have the systems for putting those in place. We have to develop not just education and training systems, we have to develop workforce development systems within workplaces that are also grooming our workers.
Dina, quick comment on that?
Well, I would just say that, we need to look at more innovative, creative ways to deal with the new workforce. So, for instance, I know in Europe, in terms of dealing with contracting out, I mean, you make sure that if an employer is going to contract out work, that the person gets equal pay for equal work. I think that, we need to have unions looking at organizing smaller workplaces to create, associations for workers in these new forms of work. And I think that it is a real challenge for the labor movement.
Francis?
I think the issue here that Tom's bringing up, to really get those higher wages that we all want, not everyone agrees that we all want those things, is that businesses need to invest more in the sort of productivity enhancing technology that say the Germans or the Americans use to generate their level of productivity growth. We need to be doing that. At the same time, to Linda's point, we need to be training those people to be able to use those things. Now, there's data that would suggest that Canada is not as good as, say, some other OECD countries or G20 countries, what have you, in adopting new technology. We may invest in it, but we may not be as good as adopting at it.
Last 20 seconds to Linda.
Well, I think all of the points that have been made are very valid. I think there's a change in the labor market coming that's going to help a lot of this. I think training is a big part of the solution, but there are lots of other solutions, and I agree with everybody that said it's really a partnership. Us, the employers, workers themselves, and everybody has to be part of the discussion, I think, about how we move from a labor market surplus to a labor market shortage in ways that produce great jobs with great pay scales.
And that's the last word on this. Can I thank everybody for coming in and participating in our discussion tonight? Tom Zizis from the Metcalfe Foundation, Dina Ladd from the Workers' Action Center. On the other side of the table, Linda Franklin, the CEO of Colleges Ontario, Francis Fong, the economist at TD Economics. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.